And so we start on Kant. Where do you start with Kant? Well, the only place to start is the beginning, unfortunately. When I treated Spinoza, I started halfway through. You just cannot do that with Kant. You wouldn't understand what the hell was being talked about. So I'll be starting with the first preface from the Critique of Pure Reason. This is the Pluhar translation published by Hackett. They're all pretty much the same, but there are some words that are different, and I'll address those when we get to them. Anyway, so we start with Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason. But before I do that, we haven't finished with Spinoza, so let me try and summarize Spinoza. Well, the ethics. The ethics is all we've covered, really. The ethics. Well, part one, he says, the essence of God is existence. Now, unwinds what the implications of that are. Part two, he says that everything we know is pretty well fucked up, and that the only thing that we know adequately, really, is the infinite and eternal essence of God, oddly enough, which is existence. Then part three, he tells us that we share the same quality as all sentient things in that we strive to persist in our being. And because we do this, there are implications of that, which are the passions and the emotions. So we are influenced by external things. Sometimes they work for us, sometimes they work against us, and we have various passions accordingly. We're either in pain or pleasure, and that's the kind of roundabout that we're on. And then in part four, he talks about reason, and he doesn't talk about reason as a palliative or a cure for the passions. He's really talking about what I would call observation and gaining understanding. And I think it's proposition 26 where he says that the only role for reason is to understand, not to try and change anything, but to understand. And that's the big message in part four. So it's about reason and the role of reason. But also reason allows us to identify the common notions. And he's told us in part two what the greatest of the common notions is. It's existence itself. So, part one, God is existence. Part two, everything's fucked up other than our ability to cognize existence. Part three, we strive to persist like every other creature, and that causes all the passions. Part four, the role of reason in allowing us to extract ourselves to some extent from that labyrinth of the passions. And part five, methods and other stuff on, well, Proposition 14 says it all, the mind can bring it about. That all the modifications of the body or the affections can be related to the idea of God. Well, that's a very quick sort of pass through the ethics, but I just wanted to summarize it because when we deal with Kant, we're into a wholly different universe. What Kant really wants to understand in the Critique of Pure Reason is how our minds work. Because if we can understand how our minds work, we can understand the kind of reality that we can know. So Spinoza doesn't really delve down into the nature of the mind as such. He does in part two to some extent. And in part two, Spinoza is groping towards what Kant called his transcendental idealism. I'm sorry, you're going to have to get used to these words. There's There's a whole vocabulary to learn with Kant, as indeed there was with Spinoza, but more so. Anyway, Spinoza was groping towards that by saying that we can only know external bodies by the way they affect our body, and we know the mind inadequately, and we know our own bodies inadequately. He was groping towards the fact that actually we live in our own cocoon that is shaped by our minds. If he could have seen that, he might not have prattled on so much about the nature of God, because that isn't possible for us to know in the way that Spinoza thinks we can know it. I'll qualify that. Spinoza was dead right, in my opinion, that the essence of God is existence, or the essence of the whole thing is existence. It's a strange thing. Kant says things about existence, but I won't get into all of that now. Anyway, so Spinoza was groping towards it, but Kant comes out with his transcendental idealism, which basically says, well, actually there is a world, there is a real world, but we can't know it. All we can know is what is given to us by the way our minds are constructed. So space, time, causality, matter, quantity, quality, a whole pile of things that we think are properties of the universe that are actually just properties of our minds. So we don't really know what the universe is. We live in a human world. Dogs live in a dog world, which is probably wholly different to ours. Whether dogs experience time, we don't know. Anyway, this is Kant's aim, to lay out in the Critique of Pure Reason, to lay out the structure of our minds and the implications of that. It's hard to overemphasize what Kant is delivering here. And I heard a podcast today, somebody talking about Mainlander. Mainlander was well, he was called a pessimistic philosopher. I don't think he was pessimistic, really. I think he was realistic. Having said that, he did commit suicide, so maybe he was pessimistic. But he was talking about Kant, and you know, so few people really get Kant. He was saying, you know, Schopenhauer looks kind of brutal and raw, but Kant is even more so, really. And in fact, in the introduction to, I think it's the Penguin edition, the guy who's written the introduction does say that many people see Kant as stark, as devoid of all feeling. I don't see it like that, but a lot of people do. But what Kant is telling you, if you really get it, and I should issue some kind of warning here, I think, you venture into Kant at your own risk. Because the ideas are very, very powerful. And Kant himself said these ideas are not for mass consumption. A, people won't be able to understand it, but B, they probably shouldn't be able to understand it. It's a bit like Metzinger, the German philosopher who's still alive and writing about similar things in a way, who said, this knowledge that there is no self and all the rest of it should not be general knowledge. It would create this breakdown of society. So we're fortunate that most people can't understand this stuff. So let me get started 10 minutes in. This is the first preface, and I shall probably spend a couple of weeks on the first preface. This is just the way it's going to be. I'm not going to get through Kant in a year. Hopefully you'll have a good feel for it within several months, but no, Critique of Pure Reason. because it's so deep. And as many people have said, every line of Kant is like a book. So I'm starting with the first preface and the first few paragraphs. I'm not going to go through all the paragraphs, but I shall pick the ones out that seem to be particularly important. So, Kant says, human reason has a peculiar fate in one kind of its cognitions. So here we go, trying to explain what the words mean. So when Kant uses the word reason, in actual fact he uses it in two senses, but I'll just talk about the sense he's using it here. Reason is not mathematics or logic. That would be included within reason, but reason is the way our minds work, basically. He's not talking about, you know, the motor function in the mind or whatever. He's talking about how we create images of things and how we form concepts. In other words, sensibility and understanding. But, you know, there's going to be a lot of these words. So human reason has a peculiar fate in one kind of its cognitions. Now the word cognitions, if you have the Penguin edition, they use the word knowledge. The problem is that the German word that is used, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it, has no direct English equivalent. So some people use the word knowledge and other people use the word cognitions. The snooty lot, the academics, like to use the word cognitions. It is apparently a more accurate representation, but you can replace the word cognitions by knowledge if you wanted. That makes it more comfortable and meaningful. So human reason has a peculiar fate in one kind of its cognitions or knowledge. It is troubled by questions that it cannot dismiss because they are posed to it by the very nature of reason itself, but that it also cannot answer because they surpass human reason's every ability. I think if the human race had understood this thousands of years ago, we might not have seen so much nonsense spoken about the nature of God, the nature of our soul, the nature of the beginning of the universe, how the universe was created, is there any experience after death, you know, so on and so forth. We ask these questions because these questions arise naturally. I'll get onto this in a minute. They arise naturally, but as Kant says, our reason cannot answer these questions because they surpass human reason's every ability. We have no concepts or data to deal with these things. You know, of course, there are people who claim that we do, but Kant does not. He doesn't claim that we have any knowledge other than the knowledge that is brought to us through our sensibility, our sensory information. Although there is another kind of knowledge, but I'll get onto that another time. But you know, basically, we learn through experience. And if our mental cocoon, the cocoon which is shaped by our mind, allows us to experience a certain set of things, we can't pretend that we know anything outside of that. That sounds very limiting, but actually you'll see later, a year down the track probably, that that's actually very freeing. So let me just read that again. Human reason has a peculiar fate in one kind of its cognitions or knowledge. It is troubled by questions that it cannot dismiss because they are posed to it by the nature of reason itself, but that it cannot answer because they surpass human reason's every ability. So let's go on to the next paragraph. Our reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. Reason starts from principles that it cannot avoid using in the course of experience, and that this experience at the same time sufficiently justifies it in using. So, let's think of something that our reason uses from experience. The classic example is causality. We think everything has a cause. You will see as we go through this eventually that causality is a property of our mind, not a property of existence. But because we believe that everything has a cause, then we start asking questions about causes. What caused the universe? Another one is time. When did the universe begin? Time is a property of our consciousness. It's not a property of what's out there. So we ask these questions about time, causality, space, matter, and so on, that are taken from everyday experience, and then we basically extrapolate to ask questions where we have no data, and we have no right to assume that those concepts actually apply. So, our reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. Reason starts from principles that it cannot avoid using in the course of experience, and that this experience at the same time sufficiently justifies it in using. By means of these principles, our reason, as indeed its nature requires it to do, ascends ever higher to more remote conditions. And as you probably know, I think it was Bishop Berkeley who calculated the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin. I think it was Berkeley. I might be wrong there. But anyway, one of the prominent philosophers of the Middle Ages calculated that. So this is a kind of silly thing that happens when we use everyday concepts and extend them into areas where we have no data. By means of these principles of our reason, as indeed its nature requires it to do, by means of these principles our reason, as indeed its nature requires it to do, ascends ever higher to more remote conditions. But it becomes aware that in this way, since the questions never cease, its task must remain forever uncompleted. Does this sound familiar? As you probably know, I'm an ex-physics guy. The questions are, physics is a reductionist kind of science. What are these? Oh, well, they're made out of those. Oh, what are those made out of? Well, they're made out of these. Oh, what are those made out of? Well, they're made out of these. And of course, now you may or may not know that they're saying that actually matter isn't made out of anything, it's actually information. Does that sound like matter might be a property of mind? It does to me. This is what Kant said 300 years ago, but that's way down the track. But, as he says, the task remains forever uncompleted because we're using a concept set that works for building bridges and aeroplanes, unless it's the Max or whatever it was aeroplane, where reason doesn't seem to have been applied all that much. We're using those concepts to then extrapolate into areas where we have no business trying to take those concepts. Thus it finds itself compelled to resort to principles that go beyond all possible use in experience, and that nonetheless seem so little suspect that even common human reason agrees with them. Physicists, they ask stupid questions. Physics is a beautiful thing and a great and grand structure. But when you go to asking questions like, how long ago did the universe begin? To me, that's a stupid question. But anyway, it may seem stupid to you the end of this. I hope so. By doing this, however, human reason plunges into darkness and contradictions. Well, of course it does, because all of a sudden we are going to come across contradictions. And you have to remember that all the talks about inflation theory and the multiverse and whatever else that physicists are talking about now, as some of the physicists are saying, this is just all basically, well, sorry to use a word, but it's wanking. Yeah, it's just mental masturbation. Well, we've got some nice mathematics, let's see if it works. I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't. So, by doing this, however, human reason plunges into darkness and contradictions, and although it can indeed gather from these that they must be based on errors lying hidden somewhere, it is unable to discover these errors. Reason cannot discover the errors because it's actually a part of reason's structure that is producing the errors. For the principles that it employs go beyond the boundary of all experience, and hence no longer acknowledge any touchstone of experience. The combat arena of these endless conflicts is what we call metaphysics. So let me just talk about metaphysics for a minute and then I'll finish this. So, metaphysics. Metaphysics is concerned with the things that go beyond our experience. If we can experience something, then we can usually make some kind of sense of it. We don't need metaphysics. But metaphysics asks questions like, is there a God? Is there freedom? Do we have a soul? What happens after death? Is there any objective morality? These are metaphysical sort of questions that, if we could answer them, would form a nice background to our understanding of life. But what Kant is saying here is that using the usual kind of mechanism of taking our usual concept set and trying to address these questions with it, we just end up with contradictions and get plunged into darkness, confusion. I mean, lots of people have answers for all these things. So in religion we have blind faith. The world was created in 7 days. This is pretty much the same as dogmatism, and Kant talks about these things in this preface. The skeptics more or less say, well, there's no point thinking about it, there are no answers. The indifferentists say it doesn't matter. Well, as soon as you say it doesn't matter, it matters. The rationalists, like Spinoza, believe it can all be figured out using logic. The empiricists basically say if it isn't an object of experience, it can't be known. That was Hobbes. Hobbes is the best example of that. But that runs into problems, because clearly we experience causality in the world, but we never see causality. You see a flash of lightning and you hear thunder, but where's the link? Where's the causal link? You never see that. You never experience it directly. So as far as Hobbes was concerned, it didn't exist, but clearly it does. For Kant, the answer to all of this, as I mentioned earlier, is transcendental idealism. The word transcendental is not used in the sense that it's used today. Transcendental really means structure of the mind. That's probably the best way to think of it at this moment in time. So an idealism, which is basically we form our world, our mind forms it. It doesn't create it, but it gives it shape, our particular experience of it. So transcendental idealism is the structure of the mind that gives the world the shape that it has. That's it. Although, really, it's a little bit deeper than that. But these are early days. So, I imagine the next 4 or 5 podcasts are going to be the first preface. This is the way it's going to be with Kant. And I've mentioned it before, but there's that beautiful line at the beginning of the Mahabharata, the movie by Peter Brooks, who was a Gurdjieff guy. In fact, you went to the same building. It wasn't the same group, but the same building, same people that I knew in London. Where the storyteller says to a young boy, by the time you've heard this story, you'll be somebody else. I think that applies to learning Kant.